Good evening and welcome to the Commemorative Air Force Warbird Tube webinar for this evening. I'm your host, Steve Buss. Very glad that you could join us, and just want to remind you that this webinar series is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. You can support CAF through membership or donations. To find out more, just visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org, and you've got details on how you can help support our mission to educate, inspire, and honor. Now, as you listen to tonight's presentation, some questions may come to mind. Just type those in the chat box, and Leah will be monitoring that, and will forward those questions to us. We'll save time at the end to make sure we get them all answered. And joining me right now from Madison, Wisconsin, the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum is Chris Kolakowski. And Chris, tonight we're going to talk about a 100th anniversary of something that's actually obviously predates World War II, but what happened in the Atlantic bombing tests really resonates throughout World War II, and you're going to tell us a little bit more about that. And of course, Billy Mitchell, being a Wisconsin native, kind of plays a central role in this entire story. So Chris, welcome, and let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks for having me tonight, especially on tonight, the actual 100th anniversary of really the climactic moment, if you will, of the Atlantic bombing tests and Billy Mitchell's, in what has been called the zenith of his career. It's certainly a great day for Wisconsin aviation, no question about that. And so in the time that we have tonight, it's great to see everybody. It's great to work with CAF. I'm actually, as you can probably tell from the pin on my collar, I'm a CAF supporter. Love what you guys do, keeping these warbirds alive and keeping them flying. But it's great to share this wonderful history, and I'm just going to dive right into what we're doing and what we're about and why it matters. Just real quick, for those of you who out in the audience who may or may not be familiar with the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, we are the state military museum of the great state of Wisconsin. We're part of the Wisconsin Department of Veterans Affairs. We've been around since 1901, and our mission is to commemorate, interpret, preserve, and affirm the role of Wisconsin veterans in America's military from 1861 to the present. We're in Madison, Wisconsin, beautiful downtown Madison, Wisconsin. We're free admission. You can just Google us and you'll find our website. We've got some great programs, do a lot of great virtual programs, including some in partnership like tonight. Check us out. There's some really, really great stuff. And of course, Billy Mitchell, as we talked about, being from Milwaukee, is arguably one of the more famous Wisconsin veterans ever. But what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about the Atlantic tests that were going on, the bombing tests that were going on in the Atlantic Ocean 100 years ago, ending actually today. If you get nothing else out of this presentation, I want you to get these 3 points. I want you to keep these 3 points in mind. The bombing tests in 1921 that were conducted off the coast of Virginia, just off the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, were really a major aviation milestone, both in terms of what they proved could be possible, but also what they foreshadowed. And we're going to explore some of that this evening. They proved that airplanes alone could sink ships solely from the air. And they were a personal triumph, and as I mentioned before, the zenith of the career for Wisconsin's Billy Mitchell in many ways. 100 years ago today, before that, it was an open question as to whether airplanes could sink ships. Could sink large capital ships like battleships and things like that. 100 years ago today, that was proven to be true. And we'll talk about that and how that goes here in a minute. And as I mentioned, it foreshadowed the future, impacted the development of military aviation. We're going to explore that. Much went into the Atlantic bombing test of 1921. Much flowed from it. And that's what makes this, what happened 100 years ago today and in the past few weeks, very, very significant, particularly to what the CAF commemorates today. So before we actually get into the test and before we get into how everything went, I want to start with a little bit of background and give you all a little bit kind of the strategic setting, if you will, for the tests. The tests are 1921. Powered flight is 18 years old. The Royal Air Force is 3 years old. So that gives you an idea of where we are in relation to the development of aviation. It's just after World War I, and in 1920, Congress passes the 1920 Defense Act, which constricts the military budget. It shrinks the military budget, what we would call after the Cold War the peace dividend. And in some ways, we're starting to see that an era of reduced defense budgets today. That was true in 1920. So the defense pie is shrinking. It's shrinking, though, at a very interesting time, because all of the services are digesting the lessons of World War I, the experience of World War I, where the airplane, the tank, the truck, the internal combustion engine really has started to open up possibilities, new possibilities for warfare. And so the Army is experimenting. In fact, the 1920 Defense Act will get rid of the Tank Corps as a unit, but tank development will somewhat continue. The Army's looking at mechanization. The Army's looking at future force structure. Part of that is the Army Air Service, which at the time is part of the U.S. Army. Of course, will later develop and transmogrify later into an independent Air Force sometime in the future. But at least at this point, it's the Army Air Service. And so there's a discussion in there of how does that relate to the Army force structure going after World War I, things of that nature. So the Army's wants its share of the pie. The Navy, for its part, the United States Navy comes out of World War I, the second most powerful Navy in the world behind only the Royal Navy. And the United States Navy, as far as they're concerned, wants to be first. And they want to build ships, and they want to expand the Navy, and they want their share of the pie to do the same thing and to become the #1 Navy in the world. So you've got this constrained budget environment as everybody's trying to get a share of the pie so that they can develop and do the things that they need to do in their way. And in these debates, Billy Mitchell, as Deputy Director of the Air Service, is a leading acolyte, if not the leading acolyte, in favor of air power and what it means to warfare on the ground and on the surface of the ocean. The Navy realizes that the airplane is a factor in war based on the experiences of World War I, based on what has been demonstrated, some of the theories that are starting to be propounded about what the airplane can do. And so they decide in 1920, there's some Navy and Marine, naval aviation, Marine Corps aviation that exists at this point. And so what they do is they anchor an old battleship in Chesapeake Bay. And in the fall of 1920, very quietly, they run a few bombing tests on it, and they throw some projectiles onto this battleship just to see what it's all about. The only thing those tests prove, though, is that you can actually hit a ship from an airplane. Because, notice I said projectiles, I didn't say ordnance. What they're dropping on this ship, the old battleship USS Iowa, are sandbags, 125-pound sandbags, and concrete bombs of 125 to 250 pounds. Best it's doing is denting Iowa's deck. But nonetheless, the Navy claims in a report, ships can't be sunk. Capital ships, battleships, the heart of the fleet cannot be touched by aircraft, cannot be sunk. It's been proven. That generates controversy because that report gets leaked. And when it gets leaked, it causes a firestorm in Washington. There are a lot of people, including in Congress, that say those aren't valid tests. You didn't use real bombs. You didn't actually use heavy bombs. There's a lot of controversy about that. And basically, all you know what breaks loose in Washington. Congress begins to use its leverage and the power of the purse to leverage the Navy into agreeing to do new tests in the summer of 1921 involving live ordnance to assess what live ordnance will do to capital ships and to various types of ships in the fleet. First in the summer of 1921, and then later with follow-ups, which we'll discuss in passing as we go. So that's how we get to the summer of 1921. That's how we get to these bombing tests in the Atlantic 3 years after the end of World War I. So what are we going to do? What are the tests going to look like? Here's the plan. The Navy's going to run them. The Navy's going to view them, and this is something that's interesting. The Navy's going to view them kind of as a science experiment. They're going to look at it as an ordnance test against the different types of ships, whereas the flyers, led by Mitchell, and we'll talk more about them and who's all involved very shortly, they see it as an ordnance test, but they also see it as an opportunity to sink ships. And at the end, that's what they want to do. The plan is very simple. The plan, we're going to anchor captured German ships, and I'll talk about who those are. There's 4 of them in a moment. We're going to anchor 4 captured German ships 50 miles east of Cape Henry, which is the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And then the air units that'll be involved in the test will fly from Langley Field, which today is Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. It's about a 70-mile flight, and at the speed, once you factor in takeoff and forming up and things like that, it takes about an hour flight time at the speed of those planes at the time. And I'll talk a little bit more about the planes when we get going. The idea is you're going to start with the lighter ships, getting progressively heavier, progressively more armored as a progressive difficulty, adding a degree of difficulty to the tests. And again, as part of the ordnance test part, you're going to run a series of bombing runs, and then after about a half dozen to 10 bombing runs, stop. Observers are going to board, assess the damage on each ship, and then come off and then signal that the next round can begin. So the Navy's looking at this again as a science experiment in many ways. The entire Atlantic Fleet will sortie from Norfolk. They're there to observe, and also they're there to sink hulks if the planes cannot. Of course, Mitchell and his flyers, as far as they're concerned, they want to make sure the Atlantic Fleet is wasting their time and has no role to play in sinking any hulks, because as far as they're concerned, they're going to take care of all the ships themselves. These tests also, the Navy wants to keep them secret, but Mitchell and the Army successfully push and make this a very public spectacle. Chief of Staff of the Army, the Secretary of War, the head of the Navy, the Secretary of the Navy, many Congress people, the senior high commands of both the Army and the Navy will be present aboard the transport Henderson to observe these tests and to see what's possible. And there's tremendous media coverage. There's a lot of interest across the United States and around the world as to what this is going to do. Although I should point out, it's only American observers that are present, at least based on the research that I've seen. I haven't found any foreign observers yet. But that's the general plan of the tests for summer 1921. Let me talk about the targets real quick. And this is something that is often underappreciated or misrepresented. I want to explain, I want to spend some time on this because this is very important. There are going to be 4 targets, and they're going to move in progressive difficulty. Submarine U-117, they're all captured German vessels. They're all combat veterans from World War I. They've been surrendered by Germany at the end of World War I. And so that's what you've got. You've got submarine U-117, a destroyer G-102, both of them lightly armored at best. And then you've got 2 armored ships, the cruiser Frankfurt and then the battleship Ostfriesland. Now, there are a lot of people that try and there's a lot of misnomers about these ships. They say that they're old, they're useless, they weren't, they're obsolete. Nothing could be further from the truth. These ships, the oldest is 10 years old. These are modern vessels. They're combat veterans. Several of them, for example, Frankfurt and Ostfriesland had fought in the Battle of Jutland, where, personal note, my great-grandfather was on the other side in the Royal Navy aboard a light cruiser. Both of them had sustained damage. Both of them had gotten home. So they are modern veteran ships that stack up very well against any of the battleships in the United States Navy at the time. And one other thing I want to mention about these German ships. The German Admiralty, and if you study World War I, particularly if you study the Battle of Jutland, you see how many of those German ships took serious damage and still made it home. The reason for that is because the German Admiralty believed that the primary mission of a major warship, like a battleship or a battle cruiser or an armored cruiser, is to stay afloat. And so they are the most advanced designs in the world in many ways in terms of inherent structural damage control to the ship. They are most compartmentalized. So if you flood one compartment, it may not have the effects it would for other designs of other ships of other navies. So what I'm saying is when you consider the targets, these are very worthy test subjects. And and Mitchell will have his work cut out, particularly with the Frankfurt and especially Ostfriesland, to prove his theories correct and to prove what's possible. So that's something that needs to be borne in mind, the nature of the targets. Here's the forces real quick. The United States 1st Provisional Air Brigade comes together in May of 1921 at Langley, 125 planes, 1,000 personnel, essentially handpicked under the command of Mitchell. It's the bulk of the air service, as a matter of fact. There are Marine Corps and Navy flyers that are involved. They will not be under Mitchell's command, but they will act in coordination with General Mitchell. The bombs, as you can see, there will be a few 125-pounders, but they generally range from 250 pounds all the way up to some big 200,000-pound bombs that will be used against Ostfriesland later. And as I mentioned, they're based at Langley Field. They do some training in Chesapeake Bay over about a month. Mitchell works himself very hard to get the force ready for this test. Everybody understands the importance of it. And as he trains bombing either wrecks, hulks in the Chesapeake Bay or bombing on beaches, things like that, he realizes that level bombing, particularly with the primitive bomb sites that exist at the time, level bombing even of a stationary ship is very difficult, particularly if there's a wind. So he develops two tactics that his forces will use. The first is that they decide to dive bomb. They're going to dive bomb the ships, come in at 60 degrees, come down, release the bomb, and pull out at about 1,000 feet or sometimes lower, and then come up. And that's a good way to more accurately deliver the ordnance. The other thing that they will develop is they'll develop a tactic which Mitchell calls the water hammer. The idea of that is that the decks of the ships are designed to repel shell fire from 13, 14, 15-inch guns being thrown from several miles away. You don't necessarily want to hit the deck because you're hitting the ship at its strength. But if you hit a near miss at the water, you get a pressure wave generated by the explosion of the bomb that also acts and magnifies the explosion against the less armored hull. The idea is you pop rivets, you pop the plates, you cause flooding, and that actually does real damage and does the real mortal damage to these ships. Mitchell did request torpedoes if they wanted to use, and the Navy wanted to use torpedoes in these tests, but the Navy demurred. The Navy said no, mostly because they had just started experimenting with torpedoes. It's way too new a technology for them. The Navy had just gotten was just starting to field its prototype torpedo bombers this summer, and they did not feel they wanted to look at bombs. They figured bombs were the bigger issue that they had to deal with in terms of assessing what they could be, what ordnance would be the biggest threat against the U.S. ships. So that's who's involved. A little bit about the planes. There are several different types. The Navy will fly a few seaplanes, but the two main types of planes, the first one is the twin-engine MB-2 that you see right here. If you're familiar with the B-10, the B-18, the interwar period, you can see where the design is coming from here. This is a Martin bomber, and this will be the primary twin-engine bomber that will be involved. And then the other strafing and light bombing, I'm talking about 125, 250-pound bombs will be carried by these DH-4s. And Mitchell will go on every single mission as well to coordinate and observe on his own, in his own personal DH-4. These have more in common, for example, with the Sopwith Camel you may be familiar with, or some of the fighters from World War I. That's, if you think of those, that's essentially what the de Havilland DH-4 is here. And here they are in formation over Langley Field. Let me talk a little bit about some of the people that are involved real quick. Of course, here's our leader, Billy Mitchell, Wisconsin-born, served in the Spanish-American War, served in World War I. By 1918, he has led the largest air offensive in the history of the world and has fought in some of the largest air battles in the history of the world up to that time. He is probably the most experienced airman in the world, period, in terms of air leader, in terms of what it takes to lead an air force. His mouth gets him into trouble. He's very much a leading acolyte for the advocate for air power, but his mouth gets him into trouble and ultimately will in 1925 and result in his court-martial. But if you consider that in many ways he's the inspiration and the godfather of the modern independent Air Force, and still a name that resonates very, very strongly today in the annals of military aviation. There's several other people that are here. If Mitchell's the godfather of the Air Force, the man who in many ways fathered the independent Air Force is this man here, Hap Arnold, who's one of Mitchell's flyers in 1921, and you can see what he does later on, and the only five-star general in the history of the United States Air Force to date. Clayton Bissell is one of the flight leaders for those bombers, those MB-2s. That will be a very important part of these tests. They'll later command 10th Air Force in the China-Burney India Theater, 1942 to 43. St. Clair Street is Mitchell's rear observer during this entire process, every single test. They'll later command 13th Air Force, 1944 to 45, but especially after the war, he will be one of the key players in developing Strategic Air Command. So it is through Street that you can draw a straight line from the Mitchell tests of 1921 through Strategic Air Command to its successor organizations, the B-52s, that are still on duty to this very minute. And so that's an interesting legacy that I just want to point out, and connection I want to point out. This is the senior Marine that's involved, very prominent commander in the Pacific War later, both on the air and on the ground, one of the pioneers of Marine Corps aviation, and quite frankly, one of the underappreciated Marine generals in the history of the United States Marine Corps. He will be flying in the Navy and Marine contingent. His deputy is this man, Francis Mulcahy, who will be a key air commander, particularly at the Battle of Okinawa in 1945 as well. And then the last notable flyer that I would mention to you, I'd commend to you tonight, is this guy, Felix Stump. You may not really know who Felix Stump is, but you may have heard of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in 1944 and the Battle off of Samar, where the three escort carrier groups, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, were surprised by the main body of the Japanese fleet. The overall commander of that task force, all three of those groups, is Felix Stump. And he gets the Navy Cross for his leadership in that action, where ultimately the Japanese break off and ultimately help win the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But there's old Felix Stump. He's one of the naval aviators in these tests. The first round of these tests goes to the Navy and the Marine Corps on June 22nd, when they're going to go out with 3 seaplanes flying in a V formation over U-117. That's her anchored there in the Atlantic on the morning of June 22nd. They come over in very level flight. They drop 250-pound bombs around her just to gauge the wind. They turn around, they come back, and they drop larger bombs, 500-pound bombs. All 3 of them strike close and on the submarine in very quick succession. And within 15 minutes, U-117 has taken her last dive. This shocks everybody except the aviators. Everybody on the surface ships that were watching had no idea that a submarine was going to succumb that quickly. If you look at World War II and you look at what Allied air power did to German submarines or what the Japanese air power did to some of U.S. submarines, we understand that a submarine on the surface is vulnerable to aircraft. That was a new lesson in 1921. Everybody but the aviators was shocked when this U-117 was gone in 15 minutes. So round 1 obviously goes to the aviators. A few weeks later, G-102 is given over to Mitchell, and Mitchell to say he's given a free hand in how he's going to do this, and he decides he's going to do a 2-wave attack against G-102. The first thing he's going to do is he's going to do strafing test and light bombing with some of the lighter bombs in his arsenal with DH-4s. And then once damage has been assessed, come in with the heavier bombs, the MB2s, in a dive bombing attack. The idea is get a sense of how easy it would be to quote-unquote mission kill. In other words, if you strafe the deck, if you knock out the armament, if you kill the captain, disable the bridge, that takes the ship out of action just as easily as if you had been, almost as thoroughly as if you had sunk her. And so that's what they do. They make a mess of her and her superstructure, render her essentially combat ineffective, and then in the afternoon, 6 MB-102s go after her. They throw a bomb all around her. Waterhammer does its trick. One bomb goes down the stack. Yes, you can see she was set on fire, and within 1 hour, G-102 is sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. This also surprises many people in the surface fleet, and Mitchell is very, very pleased with the outcome of this success. 5 days later, 100 years ago this past Sunday, the first armored target is at the mercy now of the flyers. And this time, the Navy and the Marine Corps get the mission of going and strafing her decks and trying to bomb her decks initially. And you can see they do that before lunch. This is the after lunch. And you can see, if you look at the photograph, how badly they've messed up her superstructure. But you'll notice she's still afloat. She's still trim. And so then Mitchell and his bombers set to work, and within 1 hour, Frankfurt is gone. They blow a big section of her up with some of those big 1,000-pound bombs to the point where it flies half a mile, and there are observers on the battleship Pennsylvania that have to duck at the flying debris. They crowd to the rail, and they have to run to the other side of the battleship to get out of the way. They feel the pressure wave. So this ship dies a violent death, but it's an armored ship that has also been sunk solely by air power. So as Mitchell and his men fly back that night, they have attacked 3 modern German ships, and they've sunk all 3. That leaves one left. the big prize of all, Ostfriesland. And here she is anchored in the Atlantic, a modern dreadnought battleship. Mitchell understood the importance of getting this target. He said this in 1925. He said, "This was our real test. If we could not sink this great ship, the efforts against the other smaller vessels would be minimized, and the development of air power against shipping might be arrested, at least for the time being." Everybody understands this. Everything, the other stuff was the warm-up acts. This is the main event right here. They're going to go after Ostfriesland first on July 20th, 100 years ago yesterday. And the first round goes to, again, is drawn by the Navy and the Marine Corps. And they will go after her with 250-pound bombs, strafe the deck, bomb the deck. And then a little bit later on, late in the afternoon on July 20th, Mitchell will come. They have to pull back because of a weather front coming in, but he will drop a few bombs on and around her and create a water hammer effect on the stern. And you can see this is from the Navy and Marine Corps attacks here. These are violent attacks. They are going after her and throwing everything that they have at her. This is what she looks like, and this is what she looks like late in the afternoon on July 20th when the inspectors go back ashore. And if you look real carefully, you'll notice they've made a mess of her deck, particularly the area around the turrets and the midships. They've knocked out one of the starboard turrets. You can see how badly the deck is messed up and scarred. But also notice her waterline, and notice how she's slightly listing to port. And when the observers go aboard, they realize, were this wartime, first of all, they've knocked out a large part of her armament. She's essentially combat ineffective. But also, plates have been poked underneath, have been dislodged. There are leaks underneath. They figure with good damage control, she could probably get home. But for all intents and purposes, after these strikes, she's out of combat. This is a mission kill. But to the observers on the Henderson, who were expecting Billy Mitchell to, he knocked out these other ships so quickly, and then all of a sudden, here's the battleship late on the 20th. You didn't do it. Nice try, Billy, is the general attitude among many of them as they go back to Norfolk for the night. Ostfriesland stays at anchor. They monitor her during the evening. There is some concern she might sink. She does not. And the next morning, July 21st, Billy Mitchell at 8:30 in the morning will bring out, armed with 1,000-pound bombs, 6 MB2s to go after her again and try and finish her off. The observers are back. Everybody's back. The Atlantic Fleet is back for what will end up being, or what everybody expects will be the last day of the tests. There are many people that don't think Mitchell can do it on the 21st. There are other people, most notably, of course, Billy Mitchell himself and Clayton Bissell, his flight leader, that are convinced that they will do it on July 21st. This is the first strike at 8:30 in the morning, a little bit after 8:30 in the morning. You can see the strikes that are occurring. What they'll do is they bring in 6 MB2s, and they will bring them in tandem. One will dive. 60 seconds later, the next will dive, guiding on the first bomb. 60 seconds after. So it's kind of a cascading waterfall, if you will, of attacks. And you can see one has already struck in the area starboard side behind her. This is the bow of hers over here. On the starboard side, the smoke is dissipating just as another bomb has exploded off of Ostfriesland's port side here. The water hammer is beginning to strike the hull from both sides. The ship does get hit with bombs as well, directly on the deck that blow holes into her deck, things like that. She's getting pretty badly messed up. They fly away after about an hour's worth of attack, and then the naval observers go aboard. This is them leaving aboard the transport Shawmut, which is the flagship of the tests. But look at Ostfriesland here. This is from obviously an airplane. This is late in the morning. Notice her trim, and notice how badly scorched and messed up her stern area is right here. And you'll also notice by her trim, she's listing further to port, and she's down further by the stern. You can see how much closer it is if you look closely to the water as opposed to the bow. The observers, when they went aboard her, they said if it had been wartime and she had sustained this damage, she probably would not make it back to port. So Ostfriesland has been mortally wounded for all intents and purposes. She probably could survive with good water, very aggressive damage control, but for all intents and purposes, she's out of the fight, and there's a real chance she might not be able to make port in this condition. So that's the situation as the afternoon of July 21st begins, and 10 bombers, 10 MB2s with a couple of Handley Pages arrive with 2,000-pound bombs to try and finish off Ostfriesland. This is the second strike. Mitchell will be directing everything from overhead as well, and he will send in the same succession the bombers 30 to 60 seconds apart. There'll be one hit, there'll be a second hit, there'll be a third hit, fourth, a fifth. This is one of those. And after the sixth, Mitchell sees what's happened. They're striking all around. The water hammer's doing its effect. And that's the sixth one. Mitchell realizes no more is needed, and he waves the rest off. As he will later write, when a death blow is struck to a ship, there is no mistaking it. And that's exactly what has happened. As Mitchell and his airmen watch, and as the people in the ships around from the Atlantic Fleet watch, Ostfriesland, who's already down by the port side, begins to turn over. As you can see here, she begins to turn. She rolls over on her side, rolls over on her back. Stern dips. The bow goes up, claws at the sky. And just before 1 o'clock, Ostfriesland disappears beneath the waves. As this happens, in the rear seat behind Mitchell, St. Clair Street unbuckles his safety harness, stands up and starts waving his arms and cheering and yelling, "She's gone! She's gone!" And all the airmen begin to cheer. It's a tremendous moment for everybody. Mitchell, however, when he watches her go, admits later to having tears in his eyes and feeling a tremendous amount of emotion at that moment. And he would later write, he said, "We wanted to destroy her from the air. But when it was actually accomplished, it was a very serious and awesome sight." This feeling is short-lived because he also is very happy at what he's done. It's validated everything that he's argued so far. This is a great moment for him. So what does he do? He buzzes the Henderson. This is a picture of his DH-4 buzzing the Henderson immediately after the sinking of Ostfriesland. And if you look real carefully at the deck, you will see a variety of reactions. Many people are cheering. A lot of people are waving their hats. However, several admirals and several other politicians who look stricken, several admirals are seen crying at the death of this German dreadnought because they realize what the implications are for their plans and potentially for the future of the battleship. And so that's where the title comes from. This is documented instance of several admirals crying at Billy Mitchell having knocked out a German battleship. That night they go back to Langley, and 100 years ago right now, they're having one heck of a party to celebrate at Langley Field, as you can imagine. They have done it. 4 German targets, 4 sinkings. Mitchell and his flyers have done it. They will replicate defeat later against old American battleships, USS Alabama in September of 1921, and then later USS Virginia and USS New Jersey off the coast of North Carolina in 1923. This is from one of the tests, dropping white phosphorus onto Alabama in September of 1921. Once they're done with various ordnance tests and gas bombs and things like that, trying to figure out what it does to American ships, then Mitchell is given a free hand and will sink them. So he replicates the feat several more times over the coming months and years. Now, what does this mean? I told you earlier, much goes into the test, much also flows out of the test. Let's look at the impact of what happened 100 years ago, the past few weeks, ultimately culminating in today. First of all, the aviators feel validated. This is a tremendous shot in the arm for them and their efforts. It validates, as far as they're concerned, their arguments about the airplane being an important part of warfare. As a matter of fact, the naval assessors the next day after assessing these tests will say it is clear that the airplane is a powerful weapon of offense. And so many in the Navy agree that this is something. And so this development of aviation and the realization and the proof that the airplane is going to be an important part of warfare going forward leads to the Air Service becoming the Army Air Corps in 1925, later the U.S. Army Air Forces, of course, in 1941, and ultimately the creation of the independent United States Air Force in 1947. A lot of that momentum of transformation and development gets a major shot in the arm, a major boost with what Mitchell did 100 years ago today. Coincidentally, naval aviation and Marine Corps aviation also gets a boost because the Navy realizes we need airplanes. It's useful to have them around in addition with the battle fleet. So we need to develop aircraft carriers to carry these planes to sea. It's no coincidence that the first aircraft carriers are developed in the late 1920s, and the first experiments of naval aviation occur in the late 1920s to the early 30s. Now, part of this is also Mitchell's credit, because a lot of people in the Navy say, you know what, if we don't develop aircraft carriers in naval aviation, Billy Mitchell's going to do it. And do we really want the Army in charge of our aircraft carriers? So there's that element to it as well of inter-service rivalry. I do have to mention that. And then one of the other assessors of the tests as well, Admiral William Fulham, who was also on the board assessing and reporting on everything and its implications, said this. He said, the fleet with superior air forces will no doubt win the next naval battle. And when you consider Coral Sea, Midway, Philippine Sea, Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, you consider those, you realize he's being prophetic and his prophecy is true. So that's the tests, some of the tests' impact. There is another side. There are other arguments about this assessment. There are many admirals that push back on the results' validity. And by the way, I will tell you that even up to yesterday, I got comments from colleagues and from people on social media saying these tests are nothing more than a publicity stunt. They didn't really mean anything. The ships weren't maneuvering, they weren't defending themselves, they weren't conducting damage control. They also could have conceivably shot all the aircraft out of the air because they were slow. In 1921, those objections are probably valid when you consider the relative speed, the relative primitive targeting mechanisms, the state of airplane technology in 1921. But over the next 20 years, when you look at the development of the airplane by 1939, 40, 41, and certainly into World War II, those objections become less valid. Airplanes are faster, they can target better, they can carry more ordnance, they can deliver it more accurately, and they just are more capable. Airplane technology progresses over the next 2 decades in a way to start to question, to make these pushbacks, make these questions about the test less and less valid. And coincidentally, I should point out, ship design does change as well. And we can get into that in the Q&A if anybody's particularly interested. So it's not that the Navy stands pat by any stretch of the imagination, but there are questions about the validity of these tests and how much they really matter. Nonetheless, when you factor in these things and the stories I'm about to share with you, you will see that the tests and what Billy Mitchell proved, that airplanes solely from the air can sink capital ships, can sink all types of ships then in the fleet with unaided by any surface vessels, foreshadows some events that will happen in World War II that I'm sure many of you may or may not be familiar with. And I just want to run through those very quickly and then make a few concluding remarks. The first one I point out is the British attack on Taranto in November 1940, where they knock out half of the Italian fleet in port, defended. Now, granted, they are at anchor. They're also biplanes. They're swordfish flying. So this is actually a pretty good validation of wartime conditions of what Mitchell had done. But again, knocking out half of the Italian fleet at anchor there. Japanese, among other people, study this, and this is part of the inspiration, a significant inspiration, for their attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, where, of course, Battleship Row, which is right here in the foreground, suffers catastrophic damage at the part of Japanese bombers and particularly torpedo planes. Again, catching by surprise, but nonetheless a defended anchorage, knocking out battleships. Granted, they are at anchor, but they are defending themselves. 72 hours after this, all objections, for all intents and purposes, are laid to rest with the attack on Force Z HMS Prince of Wales down here in the corner, HMS Repulse, two of the most modern, two of the better ships in the Royal Navy, particularly the most modern battleship, Prince of Wales, right here. In 2.5 hours, 85 Japanese bombers and torpedo planes sent both ships to the bottom at the loss of only 3 aircraft. Winston Churchill would later say this was the biggest shock to him of the entire war. It's the first time that modern capital ships, battle cruisers, battleships, are sunk solely from the air while maneuvering in the open sea, conducting damage control, and actively defending themselves. And so anybody who doubted that the day of the battleship as the primary vessel in the fleet is closing now had ample evidence as a result of the death of Force Z in December 1941. And in case anybody needed any additional evidence for that, consider the fate of the 3 most powerful Axis battleships left starting in the summer of 1944. First, Musashi, which is one of the most powerful battleships ever built by Japan, sunk solely by American carrier aircraft during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This is her in the foreground under attack. Now, it took a lot of bombs and torpedoes from the Americans to do it, but they did it. And Musashi never fired a shot in anger at an enemy warship. The only enemy thing she ever engaged, and ultimately futilely, was American aircraft. A couple of weeks later, RAF Lancasters with big 12,000-pound bombs in Trondheim Fjord knock out the German battleship Tirpitz. This is one of the death blows here, bombing in and around her using a water hammer, but also hitting the deck hard as well. And Tirpitz sinks and rolls over into Trondheim Fjord, and she's out of the picture. And then last but not least, American carrier aircraft against Musashi's sister, the most powerful battleship afloat, arguably the most powerful battleship ever built, Yamato, sunk solely by air power, an ultimate kamikaze mission during the Okinawa campaign on the 7th of April, 1945. And so by the end of World War II, the battleship is no longer the chief arbiter or the chief anchor of the fleet, if you will, or the chief fulcrum, building block, whatever analogy you want to use of the fleet. It is now the aircraft carrier. And the airplane has revolutionized warfare. And what Billy Mitchell prophesied, what he foreshadowed 100 years ago today, has in fact come to pass. Let me give you a few final thoughts before I open it for questions. Douglas Waller, who wrote a great book, a really good introductory biography of Mitchell and the court-martial, had this to say. He said, the sinking of Ostfriesland marked the beginning of what would be a slow end for battleships. And when you consider the stories I just shared with you from 1940 to 1945, you see that slow death of battleships, the slow end of battleships as the prime part of sea power played out 20, 25 years after the Atlantic tests. And then the USAF official history of World War II says this about the tests. Disputes arose as to the manner in which the experiment directed by the Navy had been conducted. And the Joint Board's report tended to deprecate the effectiveness of aerial bombing. But the fact of the sinkings was indisputable. And that's important. For all of the discussion of how it was done, the fact, the incontrovertible fact, was 4 different types of ships culminating in a modern battleship had been sunk solely from the air. And when you consider what that foreshadows, it's kind of like the Wright Flyer in 1903, where it demonstrates the potential, or the CSS Hunley with submarine warfare. It demonstrates the potential of new technology, new warfare, new areas of warfare. But the technology requires further refinement and development to truly come into its own. That's what Mitchell did in 1921, was he developed the potential of what the airplane can do. And he foreshadowed, after 20 more years of technological development, the airplane would do. And the role that it would take, significant role that it would take in warfare, particularly naval warfare, and I would argue occupies to this day. Maybe having a little bit of other elements in company, but certainly occupies an important role in warfare today. And that is what Mitchell foreshadowed 100 years ago today. And it is because of that that I would argue Ostfriesland, that makes Ostfriesland one of the most significant shipwrecks in the last 100 years, is because of what her sinking meant and what it foreshadowed. Again, 100 years ago today. If anybody's interested in exploring this a little bit further, I recommend these resources here. There's some great stuff. Billy Mitchell wrote his account at Wing Defense in 1925. The Navy History and Heritage Command on that website has some outstanding pictures, official reports, some accounts. It's really fantastic. And then you can actually find footage from the observer ships on YouTube. So you can watch Ostfriesland if you want to, sink for yourself and watch some of the bombing tests as well. 100 years ago today, off the coast of Virginia, a major aviation milestone was reached. We need to remember it, we need to reflect on it, and we need to consider what it meant. And when you consider aviation in World War II and beyond, in many ways, it got its start, it's got a shot in the arm with what happened 100 years ago today at the hands of a Wisconsin-born, a Wisconsin-reared airman in the lead, Billy Mitchell, in the Atlantic bombing tests. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I'll stop sharing here. I'll leave this up.
Yeah, that's good.
But if anybody has any questions or anything, I look forward to answering them and having a good discussion. So I'll throw it back to you.
Okay. Well, a question I have is, what was the motivation, if you know, of Billy Mitchell to have this vision and kind of conceive of this, the concept of these tests and how they were conducted? I mean, what was it that drove him to have so much faith in air power?
I think it was essentially what he had done in World War I. He had the effective aerial bombardment on the Germans, the effective observation, also the fact that the airplane enabled you to reach out much further and expand the battle space. And he realized that you no longer have to be within gun range. You can go over we call over the horizon today. And so, you know, like you see with other people and other forms of new technology, there's visionaries who are excited by that potential and excited about the possibility. And I think it was as much a technical thing for him, and the thrill of discovery. What is this new tool? What can it? Let's take it out for a spin. Let's see what it could do. But again, he had led a 1,000-plane operation in 1918 in France. So he already had a sense of the difference an airplane could make. I think it was a little ahead of his time because the technology hadn't caught up. But that's what excited. He's like, there's real potential here. This can change everything. You see the same argument as well with the tank enthusiasts, particularly in France, England, Germany, and Patton and Eisenhower here in the United States. They're making much the same argument about armor warfare and how we're not going to be fighting in trenches anymore because the armor is going to keep moving. So there's a lot. It's a time of discovery. It's a time of real interest and energy because the internal combustion engine seems to have completely rewritten the rules. And Mitchell says, you know what? If the rules are going to be rewritten, I want to be a part of writing.
One of the questions that came in from our audience, what was the public's reaction to the test, especially on the East Coast? It's very military based, but I mean, was it widely covered in, obviously at the time, the newspapers and newsreels?
It was widely covered. Where you were, how you felt about it depended on where you were. There were a lot of people in Norfolk, which is still the home of the Atlantic Fleet, Second Fleet today, that many of them were not necessarily Billy Mitchell fans, but there were a lot of people. Mitchell's kind of like George Patton. He knew how to cut an image. He knew how to make good copy, and Mitchell knew how to exploit the papers. And it really raised his stature and made him. He was already something of a national hero. It really made him a national hero at that point. And as I mentioned, it gets worldwide play. There are people around the world that have been following this and sit up and take notice. I don't think it's a coincidence that later that year is when the Washington Naval Treaty Conference is had in D.C. to limit battle fleets, the size of battle fleets and tonnage and size of battleships, and also to try and provide some sort of rules in terms of what navies can do and what they can build. part of that is in reaction to what Mitchell had just done in the Atlantic.
And there's always politics involved, no matter what the technology is, and I'm sure those, especially on the East Coast, who are very involved in building of battleships and capital ships and aircraft carriers, really, it was just still a concept at the time. They, of course, are going to take a negative view of this, while the airplane supporters are going to have a completely different view of it. But it's interesting how the dynamic of politics and commerce that we see today in so many things rang true 100 years ago and even before that.
I was actually going to make that an exact analogy. You know, there are several weapon systems that are, a lot of people have a lot of political, social, and intellectual capital built into. And Billy Mitchell, in this case, it was the battleship. And Mitchell basically poked him in the eye and said, you know what? With my little airplane and 2 guys that know what they're doing, and if I get several of them, I can take care of what you just, you know, this massive resources that you've put into the ship. There are a lot of people that don't like to admit that they're wrong. And he basically has told them, he's like, you know, you maybe need to rethink that. And so he's going after some entrenched interests, absolutely. And you can think, I can think of several analogous situations in the years since.
What do you think Billy Mitchell's reaction would be to today's supercarriers?
Actually, I think he'd be completely okay with it, because remember, he also predicted Pearl Harbor. He also, in 1932, he predicted that it would be possible to attack Pearl Harbor from aircraft carriers. So the idea of having 4 acres of sovereign U.S. territory, you know, the Nimitz class, soon the Gerald Ford class, steaming around the world, as you know, as a power projection platform and everything that the modern air group is capable of, very much would be part of his vision in terms of what air power can do. He would have wanted the Army to run them, or the Independent Air Force to run them, but at the same time, you know, as an advocate for air power, that was very much in his vision. That was very much something he wanted to see materialize. He didn't live long enough to really see that. He died in 1936, of course, but that was something that he wanted to see materialize.
One of the questions that came in, and I think you covered it in the presentation, but I'll give you a chance to maybe expand on it, was the viewer was saying, how was anti-aircraft fire from the battleships factored in during the 1921 tests? And again, you mentioned the lack of defense and damage control. Just any points that you just wanted to expand on from that?
Anti-aircraft fire was not really a factor.
Right.
Again, it goes back to the fact that the different views of the tests. Mitchell viewed it as a sinking exercise, a SINKEX as the Navy calls it today, a live ordnance test with the objective of getting the ship to the bottom. The Navy viewed it as much or more as a scientific experiment to test ordnance. And then whether the ships were afloat or not, it didn't matter whether the airplanes took care of it or whether the Atlantic Fleet was going to take care of it. You know, and that's their view. And so anti-aircraft was not really a factor that was thought about at the time. As they start to assess naval architecture in the late 20s and early 30s, that's where you start to see anti-air becoming a part of ship design. In fact, I would encourage any of your viewers to Google any of the battleships at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. And you'll notice that when they're built in 1916, they all undergo a refit in the early 1930s, where they get anti-aircraft, they get torpedo bulges, they get increased armor on the hull. A lot of this is in response to what Mitchell has proven in 1921. That rebuild is part of the response to the weaknesses exposed in 1921.
Question here, can you talk about Curtis LeMay's naval demonstration?
You know, it's funny. I gave this talk last night, and this came up in the questions too. One of the agreements that is made, because there's a lot of discussion in the early 30s as air technology is moving very quickly in the early 30s, and there's an agreement between the chief of the air, or the chief of the Navy, and the chief of the Army, that the Army will not fly more than 100 miles offshore. And that agreement holds for about 6 years. But there's some question as with now the B-17 is coming online and things like that. You know, the Army can really reach out and touch. I mean, you think about what the B-7, the range of the B-17, all the things it did in World War II, that capability is now here. And so the Army said, we need to fly further. And the Navy said, prove it. Prove you can do this. And so young Lieutenant Curtis LeMay, navigating a flight of 3 B-17s, takes off from, I believe it's Lakehurst, New Jersey, in summer of 1938, and flies out along the southern coast of Long Island to intercept at sea the Italian liner Rex, which is on its way. It's cruising across the Atlantic to New York. It's about a day out from New York. It's broadcast live on CBS radio. So the Army Air Force really stakes a lot on this, because if you blow it, you're blowing it on live radio around the world. And LeMay, within 5 minutes of the planned interception time, he finds the Rex. And it's a huge moment, because it proves what the Army Air Force can do and what land-based air power, the potential of land-based air even within the sea. And in fact, I love the Italian captain watching the B-17s above, radios up to them and says, I'd invite you down for lunch, but I know you're otherwise occupied. It's just a great story. But that, when you think about what B-17s and particularly B-24s do in the Battle of the Atlantic against German U-boats from both sides of the Atlantic and Greenland, none of that would have necessarily been possible, or would have been much harder to develop without old Curtis LeMay leading the interception of the Rex in 1938.
For those who may not know Billy Mitchell's entire story, and you kind of have or may have a kind of passing view of his career, after the success of these tests, he does run afoul with the military brass and ends up in a court-martial. If you could just kind of give us a little synopsis of what happens to his career after this.
Sure. And I alluded to it a little bit in the presentation where I talk about Mitchell's mouth gets him into trouble. He's one of those people that tends to make very strong statements and tends to make very declarative statements, ruffles a lot of feathers, to be polite. He sometimes makes as many enemies as he does friends. That's why he's never actually chief of the Air Service, is because they always find somebody, the Army always finds somebody to be above him to keep their thumb on it and try and keep him in some check. And there are a lot of people that agree with him. They just don't necessarily agree with his methods. In 1925, they finally had enough of him in Washington, and so they exile him to Fort Sam Houston, Kelly Field, today Kelly Field. And he's down there, and at that point, the Navy, who is experimenting with airships, flies the airship Shenandoah on a cross-country tour, runs into some weather. There's some maintenance issues already with it. Runs into some weather, crashes. Crew aboard, most of the crew aboard, I think all the crew aboard, dies. Huge national news. Mitchell then writes a letter to the papers, basically accusing the War Department and the Navy Department of dereliction of duty and calling their conduct treasonous. He uses that word. And he implies that the president, as commander-in-chief, also falls into this as well. And if anybody in the audience, I'm sure in this audience you probably do, knows even the barest minimum about military discipline, when you say those things about your superiors, particularly in public like that, that is the definition of insubordination. And so they bring him up on charges, they court-martial him, and they suspend him for a couple of years without pay. But before that sentence is carried out, he goes ahead and retires. So that's the end of his career. He'll continue to write, he'll continue to be an air power advocate until he dies of a heart attack in 1936, and is actually buried in Milwaukee, within earshot of jets flying in and out of the General Mitchell Airport at Milwaukee. So that's what happens to Mitchell after this.
And eventually, he gets some modicum of recognition with the twin-engine B-25, North American B-25, being nicknamed the Mitchell during World War II.
It's the only bomber ever named for an officer that the American Air Force has ever flown. And part of that, I think, was Hap Arnold, because Hap Arnold actually testified in Mitchell's defense at the court-martial.
That's right.
And was a huge acolyte. In fact, he later would admit that he built the Army Air Forces on the theories and on the discussions and the doctrine that he learned from Billy Mitchell. And so, you know, it's just like with St. Clair Street and Strategic Air Command. You know, you can draw a straight line from Billy Mitchell. That's why I said Billy Mitchell's the godfather of the Army Air Forces, and then the Independent Air Force. Hap Arnold is the father. And it's that connection and that inspiration. And Mitchell still is today. He was named, was it 2002 or 2001? The class, one of those classes at the Air Force Academy, named him their exemplar. The classes starting in 2000, Air Force Academy classes name an exemplar to exemplify the values of the class or what the graduates in that class should try and emulate in their career. And Billy Mitchell was the class, I forget which year, but it was one of those, and it was one of the first ones named. That says a lot about where he is in the pantheon, even today in the U.S. Air Force.
I think it was 1929, he does mention, you mentioned this as well, about the vulnerability of Hawaii being vulnerable to attack. Was it just based, do you know if it's based on any observations that he had made of any other countries, or just sort of the kind of his vision of where aviation was going?
I'm venturing into mind reading, which is always an interesting thing.
Right.
I will say he was one of those guys that even after he retired, he kept his finger on the pulse of what was going on. And by 1929, you have the British have experimented with air. They built their own purpose-built one in 1926. The Americans had built Langley in 1927. Lexington and Saratoga were being converted from battle cruiser hulls, and they were operational or about to be in 1929 also. So he followed those developments, and it didn't take a great deal of. He was basically able to see where the technology was going and extrapolate and say, if these carriers, particularly if the airplanes can have longer ranges and longer legs than what they had even 10 years before or in World War I, you know, this is a real possibility. And I should point out, in 1932, people forget this, the Navy actually ran an exercise where they fake bombed Pearl Harbor from Lexington and Saratoga. Admiral Ernest King was the commander of the task force that did it. So the Navy actually ran an exercise 9 years before the Japanese attack that proved that, yes, what Mitchell said was technically feasible. As a side note, the main reason, at least the way my reading, the main reason that we got surprised on December 7th, 1941, was because nobody thought the Japanese would be crazy enough to steam 6 carriers 4,000 miles to the doorstep of Oahu and bomb Pearl Harbor and run that risk with a big part of their fleet. But that's exactly what they did. So, and that might be a whole other talk for a whole other time, Steve, but we'll leave that for right now.
That sounds good. Well, we've cleaned up all the questions from the audience, and we're just a little over an hour, but I want to give you, Chris, a chance to maybe make some final observations or thoughts before we close out tonight.
Just when we think of aviation, we think of the development of aviation. Aviation is a relatively young thing. And when you think about the aircraft in the CAA inventory, they didn't just appear. There are lessons that were learned that informed their design, informed their tactics, informed their doctrine, informed the people that then use them in combat. That is true of the World War II aircraft. That's true of Korea, Vietnam, even right up to today. We tend to think, when we think of aviation, we think of even naval warfare, we tend to think of it as technology. And yes, technology is a very important part of it. Never, ever forget the human factor, because at the end of the day, this is a story about people. And without people like Mitchell, without people like Hap Arnold, the people we've been discussing tonight, you know, you start thinking through the implications if some of these events don't happen the way they do. And who knows where we are. And so as you leave tonight and you think about why this stuff matters, I commend that to your attention. And lastly, I'd simply invite everybody, next time you're in Madison, come down and see us on the Capitol Square at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum and check out our programs. And Steve, thanks for having me. This has been fantastic.
Oh, yes. Enjoyed the presentation thoroughly. I hope our audience has as well. And Chris, you have such a passion for history and for this story in particular. It's just a pleasure to listen to you talk tonight. And yes, next time we're in Madison, we're coming down to see you.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, thank you again to everyone in the audience for joining us for another CAF Warbird Tube webinar. If you have any suggestions for future topics, please drop Leah Block a note at media@cafhq.org. And we'll be back next Wednesday night, 7 o'clock Central Time. Until then, thanks again to Chris Kolakowski from the Wisconsin Veterans Museum for being our guest tonight. I'm Steve Buss, and for the Commemorative Air Force, have a great night.